Breath and the resistance to breath. First of all, the facility or the quality of conscious breath is transformation, is relaxation, is energy, is peace, is health, and facilitates a connection with self, which is the witness that holds space for the ego, for the identity, thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and the physiology, the being. The witness holds the container for the I to attach, to identify with the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And so the resistance to breath is the resistance to that movement, that flow. And it comes from the traumatized ego. The traumatized ego recognizes its mortality, recognizes that it could die, that the pain that happened before in the loop of time could happen again. And the ego is attached to its pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And it does not want to die. It does not want to face trauma again. And so the resistance to breath, which is the cycle, the fundamental cycle of life, is the resistance to re-traumatization through physical death, financial death, social death, or image death. Humiliation is the death of an image. When an image is honored, the ego is secure and lives. When the image is dishonored through humiliation, the ego dies. Right? There's a part of the ego that dies, that loses a sense of itself, that feels insecure. And so the ego's primary attachment is to avoid those various forms of ego death. By avoiding the unknown, by controlling reality, by avoiding change, and by seeking to figure things out. And all of those are efforts to control other people and reality and oneself, because you cannot control other people and reality without controlling yourself, right? You've got to do this and say this and emote this and do this and think this so that you can do this, so that this person will do this and this, so that then that will happen, so then this will happen, and then we can be safe. Then the ego can hold on to its identity, to its pattern. You could also say I-density, right? Because the pattern is more dense than just flowing energy. A pattern has a density, it has a rhythm. Now, The funny thing is with the ego is that it is just as attached to its miserable patterns as to its transcendent patterns, to its luminous patterns, to its creative patterns, to its joyful patterns. The ego is attached and holding on to and preventing the death of its pattern, regardless of whether that pattern is making the ego miserable or happy or uncomfortable or all kinds of things, or joyful. The ego, I, identifies with the pattern. That's me. I am depressed, and you're trying to mess with it. Don't mess with me. I'm depressed. Don't mess with me. I'm angry. I am angry. Don't mess with me, right? Don't change my pattern. I am ... right? Thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And the thoughts are a good starting point because they lead to so much of the rest, right? Because if you think the thought, I'm not good enough, you will feel the corresponding feeling. If you think and feel the corresponding feeling, your physiology will change. And if you think, feel, and physiologically change, your sense of being will ultimately change. Your body will slowly change. And if you change all of those things and act accordingly, your reality will change. And now a seed, a thought, has blossomed in its integrity into a world in which I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, I am not. That's a thought. And the ego holds that thought. This is my pattern. I am this. This is who I am. Nobody should change me. I am this. And nobody can take it away from me. I don't want to die. I don't want to be out of control. I don't want to change. And so it is the breath that washes the pattern of the ego away. It is the breath that takes us back to ourself, back to our innocence, which is the stem cell of the psyche. Innocence is the stem cell of the psyche because out of innocence can be birthed hostility or joy. It's whatever the shape the energy is asked to take. In innocence, we don't judge, we allow the energy to be born, and it becomes whatever it is asked to become. But in changing, in becoming something new, the ego is disoriented, loses control. And the question is, does the ego trust that process? And the transcendent ego, the ego that has been loved within or without, says yes. The traumatized and unloved ego says no, I don't trust the process because I am traumatized and unloved because I trusted a world that traumatized and didn't love me. And so I don't trust the process, right? And so then I attach to the traumatic, the traumatized identity. And having formed a traumatic identity, my pattern of thinking and feeling, speaking, doing, and being as a traumatized individual, I now don't let that go. Right? And in not letting it go, it provides opportunity, it provides fuel for the cultural identity to grow, to change, or to die, right? Because if the entire cult clings to a traumatized identity and will not respond to that traumatized identity, then the cult dies. Or the cult learns to respond, learns to love the traumatized identity. And so the cult grows, right? Because now the cult is elevating its intelligence. It takes a low level of intelligence to traumatize its members. But it takes a higher level of intelligence to heal the trauma that it has caused, not the same level of intelligence. And so there is, in a sense, the push to die or to transcend as a cult level, at a cultural level. And the question is, what will happen? Well, 95% of all cults, of all cultures, are extinct. But what will happen to this one, right? Well, eventually, in those statistics, there's a 95% chance it will mutate to an extraordinary and unrecognizable degree, or it will die as a cult, as a culture, and create room for a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that will serve as the habitual backbone of a people that rely on a reservoir of memes, of unconscious patterns to do because that's what we do, right? Because that's what makes a culture a cult. Is we do these things, we think these things, we feel these things because that's what we do. And we do them because we did them. And we did them because maybe far in the past there was a reason that is often forgotten in the present. In the same fractal pattern of an individual that far in its past there was a reason why it curled up in a fetal position and didn't want to grow. There was a reason for that in the 2-year-old biology. But even though we have forgotten that reason, and even though that reason no longer exists, when certain opportunities and energy fields approach us today, we want to curl up and avoid them because our identity has not transcended the meme, the cult, the original pattern that kept us alive in a very specific time. See, in breath promises to liberate us from those patterns, to take us into the unknown. Breath opens the doorway of the self-referential loop that is the pattern and confronts us with the other and the one. Because from the ego's perspective, everything outside the boundary of the identity of the pattern is other, which means from the ego's perspective, it is a very tiny speck in a vast and unmeasurable whole. It's me, and then everything else that is trillions upon trillions of times bigger than me. From the ego's perspective, it's very small. But as you transcend the ego's pattern, letting in energy from outside the boundary of our self-referential loop of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Now, we touch the other, but in transcendence, we also allow the other to touch us. We become one with the other in the relay of energy, in the relationship. And so we are also becoming one with all that is to a larger extent, which means giving up control for the ego, because the ego cannot measure, cannot control all that is. So this is the pattern, right? So in breath, we are transcending the boundary, we're going out. So let's breathe for a moment. So as I begin to touch that transcendent place, which is unknown, I have a reflex in parts of my body that clench. And I have a thought reflex as well that says, what about this and what about that? What about this, right? What about this and what about that, right? I have to control. And there's plenty of legitimate reasons in the sense that I didn't get this video from my crew. What if this is happening? What's that? I should go out and figure it out immediately, and then I can do something about it. But this reflex to anxiously hang on doesn't come up when I'm watching TV, for example. It doesn't come up when I'm worrying and already doing that. It comes up at the point when I'm transcending that pattern, when I'm letting something bigger than that pattern touch me, because that's what challenges the ego's identity, right? And, it's true. It's absolutely true that I could be out doing work right now. I could be looking at this. There's weeds in the garden that do need pulling. And there's this and there's that. All of that is true, right? But that's not the reason that reflex comes up right in this moment, right? The ego is more comfortable in words than in presence. So that reflex didn't come up when I'm talking about these ideas. The breath is what transcends words. So the clench comes up, it takes far more time to talk about all of this, for example, than it does to breathe. That's fine, right? That's not going to ruin the world, according to the ego, to spend an hour discussing breath. That's fine. But to spend 30 seconds, to spend a minute or two breathing and really transcending, well, what's going to happen? What? That's the bit where suddenly it becomes an urgent need to, has so-and-so replied to this email? What if they're waiting, right? And then what if that, right? That's the point where the resistance is. And so let's go back to the breath. And one of the hardest things in breathing is there's a not knowing, right? Like that's where my mind goes, is like, I don't know. I don't know the point. I don't know where this is going. I don't know what should happen here, right? And so the traumatized ego is very upset with not knowing, because the traumatized survivor often survives by figuring out and controlling things to avoid more of the trauma. And so to the trauma survivor, the traumatized ego, not knowing is a big deal. Like, I've got to know, I've got to see what's going on so that I can prepare, so that I can avoid the next trauma, right? So that's one of the hooks. And that's all it takes to get in touch with self, to get in touch with the witness, to find the self that transcends the pattern, right? And once that self is found, once I find myself, then I'm not alone, so I'm not lonely. Because I'm not alone and not lonely, I'm here to go with the ego through whatever things may come up for the ego. I'm the companion, the supportive, loving witness to be with the ego. The ego doesn't have to be perfect anymore. We'll do it together. And that's also hard for the abused child to understand, because the abused child never received unconditional love. The abused child had to be perfect and still was abused because they never could be perfect. And so to be set up in a terrain it doesn't understand is expecting to be shamed and blamed and humiliated for doing it wrong. And so to experience, for the ego to experience the self that is present and connected and loving unconditionally, for the ego to experience that self, that is a little disorienting, and the ego doesn't have a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being for responding to that. It doesn't know how. It has a pattern for being what to do when you're shouted at and what to do with this. It has a pattern that helped it survive that. But what is the pattern for presence, for being loved? The ego doesn't know.